Here's something that should bother you. FEMA, the agency created in 1979 specifically so you wouldn't have to go it alone during a disaster, has been telling the American public for decades that the minimum standard is 72-hour self-sufficiency. 3 days. They put it right on ready.gov. They've said it so often it's become background noise. But here's what they don't put on the website. In 2026, if you actually need them, the version of FEMA that shows up may look very different from the one you've been counting on. Not because of a hurricane, because of a budget line. The cuts are real. The math is not in your favor. And every career professional in disaster recovery who's paying attention is quietly saying the same thing. The window between when disaster hits and when federal help arrives just got wider. A lot wider. Today's video isn't political. I don't care which party you're registered with. I've spent over 20 years in corporate disaster recovery and business continuity, Fortune 500 companies, hospital systems. I built the plans, and I've watched what happens when response capacity shrinks. I want you to understand what changed, what it means for your household, and exactly what to do about it. Let's put some numbers on the table, because in my business, feelings don't write continuity plans, data does. In 2025, FEMA's workforce shrank from approximately 29,000 employees to about 23,000. That's a 14% reduction in a single year. Now here's the part that should stop you cold. The 2023 Government Accountability Office report found that FEMA was already operating at just 65% of its staffing target, short by more than 6,000 employees. Before those cuts even started, they were already understaffed, then they cut more. The FY 2026 budget proposal includes $646 million in cuts to FEMA, targeting grant programs that fund state and local preparedness capacity, and internal planning documents reported by CNN and the Washington Post describe scenarios where the disaster response workforce gets cut by 41%, and the surge workforce, the people who rush in within hours of a major disaster, gets cut by 85%. FEMA officially said those weren't finalized plans. Fine. But a veteran emergency manager quoted in that reporting said something I want you to hear. Imagine trying to plan for a catastrophic situation and being told you may or may not have 50% of your staff available. In business continuity, when a critical vendor might or might not show up when you need them, we have a technical term for that. We call them a single point of failure. And the first rule is, you do not build your recovery plan around a single point of failure. That is exactly the exercise your household needs to run right now. The first step is recalibrating your assumptions about when help actually arrives. In corporate business continuity, this is your recovery time objective. You define the realistic window between when something breaks and when you can expect functional restoration. When you know the real number, you build the real plan. When you assume an optimistic number, you get blindsided. FEMA's own operating doctrine describes disaster operations as federally supported, state-managed, and locally executed. That language has been there for years. What's changed is how thin that federal support layer has become. Here's the sequence when a major disaster hits your area. Local first responders activate, already overwhelmed by life safety calls. Local emergency management engages. The governor formally requests a federal disaster declaration. The president approves it. Only then does FEMA begin deploying. Under normal conditions, that window was 24 to 72 hours before federal resources started moving. But multiple states documented waiting weeks, sometimes months, for declarations to be processed in 2025. And a former senior FEMA official told CNN directly, "The regional offices are almost entirely core staff, so the first FEMA people who are usually on site won't be there. The impact is states are on their own." That is an insider. That is the honest operational assessment. Stop planning around 72-hour self-sufficiency. Adjust your household's working assumption to a minimum of 7 days, ideally 14. That's not paranoid. That's what the current data says to do. If straight talk preparedness content, no hype, no gear lists, no politics, is what you've been looking for, subscribe. New video every week. This is Prepared, Not Paranoid. In corporate preparedness, before you build a recovery plan, you run a business impact analysis. You identify your critical functions, map your dependencies, and find the gaps before a disaster finds them for you. You need to run the same exercise for your household. I call it the household continuity audit. It starts with one honest question. What does my household depend on that requires external infrastructure to function? Power, water, medical supplies and prescription medications, communication, fuel, cash, food, heat, or cooling. Think about 1985. If the power went out in your neighborhood for 3 days, your parents figured it out. There was cash in the kitchen drawer, a pantry with actual food, and a neighbor named Frank who had a generator and didn't need to be asked twice. They weren't prepper types. They were accidentally resilient because they weren't dependent on a connected system for everything. Today, most households are embedded in digital infrastructure in ways we don't consciously register. Electric stoves, gas furnaces with electric ignitions, prescription auto refills at pharmacies that run on power, money that lives on a card, and nowhere else. Run through each category. For each one, ask, if this external input stopped for 7 to 14 days, what is my backup? Take 20 minutes this week and list your household's top 5 critical dependencies in order of priority. Water first, always water first. Then power, medical, food, communication. Just make the list. That list becomes the blueprint. I've reviewed a lot of household preparedness plans over the years. The same 3 gaps appear every single time. I'm going to name them because naming the problem is the first step toward closing it. Gap 1. The documentation gap. Most people cannot access the documents they need to start disaster recovery without going back to their homes. Insurance policy numbers, medical records, bank account information, vehicle titles, mortgage documents. A colleague of mine lost her home to a house fire. No injuries, fortunately. She spent the next 6 months fighting with her insurance company because her entire policy file was in a cabinet that was now ash. The fix is straightforward. A fireproof document box at home, plus a digital backup stored somewhere outside your house. Cloud storage, encrypted drive at a family member's place, something. This is one afternoon of work. Gap 2, the communication gap. Most household emergency plans assume everyone has a phone, that the phone is charged, and that the cell network is functioning. After a major disaster, cell networks often fail first. Tower damage or catastrophic demand overload. Your family needs a physical rally point that everyone knows without looking it up. A specific address, written down in every wallet on paper. Yes, paper. Call it old school, I call it reliable. Gap 3, the financial gap. After a major disaster, ATMs go dark and card readers go down. Cash is the operating currency for the first 48 to 72 hours in a disaster area. FEMA assistance, even when it does arrive, takes time to process. The standard guidance is $200 to $500 in small bills, accessible at home in a fireproof container. 5s, 10s, 20s. This is not eccentric, this is prudent. Identify which of these 3 gaps exists in your household right now. Pick one and close it this week, just one. Here's where I'll push back on most of the preparedness content you'll find online. The majority of it is about stockpiling. How many cans, how many gallons, what gear to buy, and supplies matter. I'm not dismissing that. But a garage full of canned goods with no documented plan for how to use them is not preparedness, that's inventory. In business continuity, we don't just order backup hardware and call it a disaster recovery program. We build a system, a set of documented procedures that work even when the people who usually run them aren't available. Even when conditions are abnormal, even when the scenario doesn't perfectly match the plan you wrote. The difference between a household that recovers fast and one that doesn't almost never comes down to who had more stuff. It comes down to who had a written plan that everyone in the household actually knew about. A functional household recovery system looks like this: a written emergency plan on paper, not just in your head, that everyone in the house can find. A go bag with 72 hours of essentials staged near the door, a 7 to 14 day supply of food, water, and critical medications, an out-of-area contact number, because calling someone 3 states away often works when local calls don't, and a short list of your top 5 household vulnerabilities with at least one mitigation step for each. You know what that is? It's the laminated card your parents kept in the junk drawer. Emergency numbers, neighbor's address, when to call the fire department versus the police. Analog, redundant, reliable. Simple systems that work when everything complicated fails. Write down on paper, actual paper, where your go bag is, where your emergency documents are, and what your family's out-of-area contact number is. Give it to everyone in the household. That one action puts you ahead of the overwhelming majority of American households. If you want to build a complete household emergency plan from the ground up, the actual corporate-grade framework, not the survivalist checklist version, I've got the full walkthrough linked in the description. Worth 10 minutes of your week. Let me bring this home. FEMA's cuts are real. The response gap is wider than it's been in decades. The structural shift from federal to state, and ultimately from state to you, is happening whether the politics settle or not. In my business, you don't argue about the operating conditions. You plan around them. 4 steps. Recalibrate your timeline. 7 to 14 days of self-sufficiency, not 72 hours. Run your household continuity audit and list your top 5 dependencies. Close your biggest gap: documentation, communication, or cash. And build the system, not the stockpile. Put the plan on paper and make sure your household knows where it is. Your homework for this week, and it takes less than 10 minutes. Find your homeowner's or renter's insurance policy. Write down the policy number and the claim's phone number. Then put that information somewhere that is not inside your house. Email it to yourself, drop it in a cloud folder, text it to a family member in another state. That single action could be worth thousands of dollars when you need it most. You don't have to be ready for everything. You just have to be ready for the most likely things. I'm Ernie. This is Prepared Not Paranoid. Build the plan. Skip the panic.